The morning of February 23, 1943, outside the village of Sidi Bouzid in central Tunisia, Lieutenant James Bates of the 1st Armored Division climbed out of his M4 Sherman tank and walked toward the hulking shape sitting disabled in the sand. The Panzer IV had taken a direct hit to its track from a 75mm round, immobilizing it but leaving the hull largely intact. The German crew had abandoned it during the night, retreating with Rommel's forces toward the coastal plain. Bates had been told to wait for the ordnance team, but curiosity pulled him forward. He had never been this close to a German tank before, not one he could examine without someone shooting at him. The Panzer IV sat low and menacing in the morning light, its long 75mm gun traversed slightly to the left, pointing at nothing. The armor plates were welded cleanly, painted in the tan and brown camouflage scheme the Afrika Korps used in the desert. Bates walked around the front, studying the glacis plate, the driver's vision port, the machine gun mount. He reached out and touched the frontal armor with his palm. It was cool in the dawn air, solid, German. This was the tank that had torn through British armor at Gazala. This was the machine that American intelligence briefings had warned them about repeatedly since they landed in North Africa 3 months earlier. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Bates knew what he had been told in training. German tanks were superior. German engineering was meticulous, precise, ahead of Allied capabilities. The Wehrmacht's panzer divisions had conquered Poland in weeks, overrun France in 40 days, driven deep into the Soviet Union. Their tanks were the reason. Better armor, better guns, better design. American tankers going into combat for the first time carried this knowledge like a weight. They were driving Shermans, tanks that had been rushed into production, designed by committee, built by automobile companies that had never made armored vehicles before the war. Adequate machines, they were told, but not exceptional. Certainly not equal to what the Germans fielded. When the ordnance team arrived 2 hours later, Bates watched them work. Captain Robert Clark commanded the technical intelligence section attached to 1st Armored. His team carried measuring tools, cameras, notebooks, and a systematic approach to examining captured enemy equipment. They photographed the tank from every angle, documented damage, recorded serial numbers and manufacturer markings. Then they began the detailed work of measuring armor thickness at multiple points on the hull and turret. Clark used a portable ultrasonic thickness gauge, a relatively new piece of equipment that could measure steel plate without drilling through it. He placed the sensor against the frontal glacis plate, the main armor protecting the driver and hull gunner. He checked the reading twice, frowning. He moved to another spot on the same plate, and measured again. Then he called over his assistant, Sergeant William Morrison, and had him verify the measurements independently. Morrison took his own readings, compared them with Clark's notes, and looked up with an expression of confusion. The frontal hull armor on this Panzer IV Ausf G, one of the most recent variants the Germans were fielding in Tunisia, measured 50mm thick. Not the 80 or 90mm that intelligence estimates had suggested, not the 100mm that rumor and fear had inflated it to in the minds of men preparing for combat. 50mm. The same thickness as the frontal hull armor on the M4 Sherman, which was 51mm at vertical mounting. Less effective than the Sherman's glacis when the American tank's armor angle was factored in. The mythology surrounding German armor superiority had deep roots, planted years before American soldiers ever faced panzers in combat. It began with newsreel footage of the Blitzkrieg, images that shocked the world in 1940 and 1941. German panzer columns rolling through the Ardennes forest, through the supposedly impassable terrain that French military planners had assumed would protect their northern frontier. Tanks crushing through defensive positions, infantry running before them, entire armies encircled and captured. The word Blitzkrieg itself, lightning war, carried psychological weight. This was a new form of warfare, mechanized and unstoppable. American military intelligence services studied German armor extensively in the years before the United States entered the war. They interviewed British officers who had faced panzers in France and in the North African desert. They examined destroyed German tanks when examples became available. They read German technical manuals captured in combat. They compiled reports on panzer tactics, armor specifications, and combat performance. These reports formed the basis of training materials distributed to American armored units, preparing for deployment overseas. The intelligence assessments emphasized German technological sophistication. German optics were superior, providing better target acquisition and ranging. German armor steel was of high quality, properly heat-treated and face-hardened. German guns, particularly the new long-barreled 75mm Quake 40 mounted on later Panzer IV variants, had excellent armor penetration at combat ranges. German tank crews were experienced, many having fought in Poland, France and Russia, before facing American forces. German tactical doctrine emphasized combined arms operations, coordinating tanks with infantry, artillery, and air support effectively. All of this was true. German technology was sophisticated, German guns were effective, German crews were experienced, German tactics were refined through years of combat. But the intelligence picture was incomplete, shaped by the fog of war, and by the natural tendency to overestimate enemy capabilities. When you're preparing men for combat, you emphasize threats. You tell them the enemy is dangerous, well-equipped, professional. You don't want soldiers going into battle overconfident. Better they respect the enemy and take appropriate precautions. British experiences in North Africa had reinforced the mythology. The Desert Fox, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had defeated British armor repeatedly in 1941 and 1942. At Gazala in May and June of 1942, Rommel's Afrika Korps destroyed over 200 British tanks, routing the 8th Army and driving them back to El Alamein. British tankers reported being outgunned and outmaneuvered. Their Crusader and Stuart tanks were inadequate against German armor. Even the newer Grant and Sherman tanks the British received, American production struggled in combat against experienced panzer units. American tankers arriving in North Africa in late 1942 absorbed these lessons. They heard stories from British veterans about Panthers and Tigers, the new heavy German tanks rumored to be invincible. They heard about 88mm anti-tank guns that could destroy Allied tanks at ranges where Allied guns were ineffective. They heard about German tactical superiority, how panzer commanders used terrain and combined arms to win battles even when outnumbered. The message was clear. German armor was formidable, possibly superior to anything the Allies fielded. The reality of combat at Kasserine Pass in February 1943 seemed to confirm these fears. German forces under General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim attacked American positions in western Tunisia, exploiting gaps in the defensive line. American units, many in combat for the first time, were overrun. The 2nd Armored Division lost significant numbers of tanks. Infantry positions were bypassed and surrounded. American forces retreated over 50 miles before stabilizing the line. Kasserine was a tactical defeat, embarrassing and costly. In the aftermath, American commanders emphasized the need for better training, better coordination, and respect for German combat effectiveness. The lesson many American tankers took from Kasserine was that German tanks were superior and German tankers more skilled. This was partly true but incomplete. German tactical execution at Kasserine had been excellent, but German armor itself was not the invincible force that mythology suggested. American tank crews climbed into their Shermans carrying the weight of inferiority. The M4 Sherman medium tank had entered production in 1942, designed to replace the obsolete M3 Lee with its awkward sponson-mounted 75mm gun. The Sherman was a compromise machine, balancing armor protection, firepower, mobility, and mechanical reliability. It was never intended to be the best tank in the world, just good enough to be produced in overwhelming numbers, and shipped across oceans to fight on multiple continents simultaneously. The Sherman's specifications reflected American design philosophy. The tank weighed approximately 30 tons in its most common variant, the M4A1 with a cast hull. Frontal hull armor was 51 mm thick, mounted at a 56-degree angle from vertical, providing effective protection equivalent to approximately 75 mm against anti-tank fire. The turret front had 76 mm of armor on the gun mantlet. Side and rear armor was thinner, 38 mm on the hull sides, designed to resist small arms and shell fragments, but not direct anti-tank fire. The main armament was a 75 mm M3 gun, adapted from a French anti-aircraft gun design. This gun fired several types of ammunition: armor-piercing shot for engaging enemy tanks, high-explosive shells for attacking fortifications and infantry, and white phosphorus rounds for creating smoke screens. The armor-piercing round could penetrate approximately 60 mm of vertical armor plate at 500 yards, adequate for engaging most German tanks at typical combat ranges in North Africa. The Sherman's greatest advantage was not its armor or its gun, but its mechanical reliability and ease of production. The tank used components from the American automotive industry. The engine in most variants was a Continental R975 radial aircraft engine, producing 400 horsepower, the same engine used in training aircraft. The transmission was adapted from truck designs. The suspension used vertical volute springs, simple and reliable. The tracks were rubber-backed steel, lasting approximately 2,500 miles before replacement. Inside, the Sherman was spacious by tank standards. 5 crew members had defined roles: the driver and assistant driver, who also operated the bow-mounted 30-caliber machine gun, sat in the front hull. The commander, gunner, and loader occupied the turret. The commander had a cupola with vision blocks providing all-around observation. The gunner had a telescopic sight and a power traverse system for rotating the turret. The loader had organized ammunition racks and enough space to maintain a reasonable rate of fire. Every Sherman had a radio, usually an SCR 528 or SCR 538 set, allowing tank-to-tank communication and coordination with infantry and artillery. This was standard equipment, not a luxury reserved for command vehicles. American doctrine emphasized communication and coordination. Tank platoons operated as units, supporting each other and calling for artillery or air support when needed. The radio was as important as the gun in American tactical thinking. But despite these advantages, American tankers worried about their equipment. They had heard the stories. German tanks had thicker armor. German guns were more powerful. German optics were clearer. German crews were more experienced. The Sherman was adequate, functional, mass-produced. It was not exceptional, and in combat, adequate might not be enough. When Lieutenant Bates stood before that captured Panzer IV in the Tunisian desert, examining the tank that had driven British forces back across North Africa and bloodied American units at Kasserine Pass, he carried all these assumptions. German armor was superior. German engineering was better. The tank before him represented technological excellence that American industry could not match. This was what he believed, what he had been trained to believe, what every intelligence briefing and combat report had reinforced. Captain Clark's measurements were about to shatter that belief completely. Captain Robert Clark had joined the Army's Ordnance Department in 1938, working at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, where the military tested weapons and equipment. He held a degree in mechanical engineering from MIT and had spent 4 years examining foreign military hardware before the war began. When the United States entered the conflict in December 1941, Clark was among the first ordnance officers assigned to create technical intelligence sections that would accompany combat units overseas. His job was to capture, examine, and report on enemy equipment, providing feedback that would inform American tactics and future tank development. The technical intelligence mission was systematic and precise. When a German tank was captured or destroyed in a condition allowing examination, Clark's team followed established procedures. They photographed the vehicle from standardized angles, creating visual documentation that could be compared across different tanks and variants. They recorded all visible markings, serial numbers, unit insignia, and manufacturer stamps. These details helped intelligence analysts track German production, identify which factories built which components, and estimate manufacturing capacity. They documented damage patterns, noting where shells had struck and whether they penetrated. This information revealed which American weapons were effective against German armor, and at what ranges. They examined internal components, studying the engine, transmission, suspension, gun mounting, and fire control systems. They measured armor thickness at multiple points, creating detailed armor maps that showed exactly how German tanks were protected. The portable ultrasonic thickness gauge Clark used was a recent innovation, developed for industrial inspection, but adapted for military use. It worked by sending ultrasonic pulses through the steel plate and measuring how long the sound waves took to reflect back. The device could accurately measure armor thickness within 1 millimeter, providing reliable data without damaging the plate. Before this technology, ordnance teams had to drill small holes through armor to measure thickness, a time-consuming process that sometimes weakened the very protection they were studying. Clark placed the sensor against the Panzer IV's frontal glacis plate, the sloped armor protecting the driver's compartment. The gauge read 50 millimeters. He moved the sensor to different points across the glacis, checking for variations in thickness. German manufacturing was precise. Every measurement came back within 1 millimeter of 50. There was no doubt about the reading. The armor was uniformly 50 millimeters thick across the entire frontal hull. He measured the turret front next, the armor protecting the gun mantlet and the crew in the fighting compartment. 50 millimeters again. The turret sides measured 30 millimeters. The rear hull plate was 20 millimeters. The roof and floor were 10 millimeters. Clark recorded every measurement in his notebook, cross-referencing them with measurements from other Panzer IVs his team had examined in recent weeks. The numbers were consistent. This was not an anomaly or a single tank built to different specifications. This was standard protection for the Panzer IV Ausf. Clark knew the specifications of the Sherman intimately. He had examined dozens of M4s during testing at Aberdeen before deployment. The Sherman M4A1, the variant with the cast hull that comprised much of American tank strength in North Africa, had frontal hull armor, 51 millimeters thick. But that armor was mounted at a 56-degree angle from vertical, not straight up and down like armor on older tank designs. The angling dramatically increased effective protection. When an anti-tank round struck angled armor, it had to penetrate through more steel than the plate's actual thickness because it was traveling through the armor at an angle rather than perpendicular to it. The formula for calculating effective armor thickness based on angle was, and straightforward, a 51 millimeter plate at 56 degrees from vertical provided effective protection equivalent to approximately 75 millimeters of vertical armor against a perpendicular hit. The Panzer IV's glacis was also sloped, but only at about 20 degrees from vertical on this variant, providing minimal benefit from angling. Its effective protection was perhaps 55 millimeters equivalent. The Sherman's effective frontal protection was superior to the Panzer IV's, not by a huge margin, but measurably better. The German tank's thickest armor, the gun mantlet on the turret, matched the Sherman's turret front at 76 millimeters. Everywhere else, the protection was comparable or favored the American tank. Clark stared at his measurements, checking them a third time. The mathematics were undeniable. The Panzer IV was not more heavily armored than the Sherman. In the most critical area, frontal protection against enemy fire, the Sherman was actually better protected. Sergeant Morrison voiced what Clark was thinking. "Sir, intelligence briefings said these things had 80 to 90 millimeters on the front. We've been telling crews the Panzer IV outguns us and has better armor. But this..." He gestured at the measurements. "This is the same as what we're sitting in. may be worse when you factor the angles. Clark photographed the armor measurements with the gauge visible in the frame, creating irrefutable documentation. He would file a detailed report when they returned to headquarters, but he knew the implications would take time to filter through the system. Intelligence assessments didn't change overnight. Thousands of American tankers already believed German armor was superior. That belief affected how they fought, how they approached engagements, how much risk they were willing to accept. Changing that mindset would require more than one field report from Tunisia. The systematic examination of captured Panzer IVs continued through March and April of 1943, as Allied forces compressed the Axis bridgehead in Tunisia. Clark's technical intelligence section examined 17 different Panzer IV tanks in various states of damage. They documented 3 distinct variants: the Ausf F2 with the long 75mm gun but earlier armor configuration, the Ausf G with additional frontal armor plates welded onto some examples, and one Ausf H, the newest variant just reaching North Africa before the Axis collapse. Every tank told the same story. Frontal armor ranged from 50mm on standard models to 80mm on a few Ausf H tanks that had additional armor plates bolted to the hull front. But these up-armored versions were rare exceptions. The vast majority of Panzer IVs facing American forces in Tunisia had exactly 50mm of frontal protection, no more. Side and rear armor was consistently thinner. 30mm on the sides, 20mm on the rear, completely vulnerable to American 75mm guns at any combat range. Clark compiled his findings into a comprehensive technical intelligence report, designated TIR-43-09, submitted to 1st Armored Division Headquarters on April 17, 1943. The report included detailed photographs, armor thickness measurements, penetration test results, and comparative analysis with American tank specifications. His conclusion was stated clearly in the executive summary. The Panzer IV medium tank does not possess armor protection superior to the American M4 Sherman. Frontal protection is comparable, with the Sherman's angled glacis providing slightly better effective thickness. Side and rear armor on both tanks is vulnerable to 75mm anti-tank fire at combat ranges. The report circulated through intelligence channels slowly. Copies went to 2nd Corps headquarters, to 5th Army in Algeria, to the War Department in Washington. Officers read it with skepticism. The assessment contradicted established intelligence estimates and the experiences of British forces who had fought Panzers for 3 years. Some commanders questioned whether the tanks Clark examined were representative samples or older variants being phased out. Perhaps Germany was holding back its better armored tanks for the Eastern Front, where the Soviets fielded heavier armor. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But Clark's findings were verified independently by British ordnance teams examining the same captured vehicles. The British measurements matched the American data precisely. 50mm frontal armor, 30mm on the sides, 20 on the rear. The British had been fighting these tanks since 1942. They had lost hundreds of their own tanks to Panzer IV guns. Yet, somehow the consistent overestimate of German armor thickness had persisted, passed from unit to unit, embedded in training materials and intelligence summaries. Lieutenant Bates received a copy of Clark's report in late April. He read it carefully, comparing the measurements to what he knew about his own Sherman. The numbers were clear but difficult to accept emotionally. He had been in combat for 4 months. He had seen Shermans knocked out by German fire. He had felt the impact of 88mm shells hitting near his tank, felt the concussion wave, seen the damage those weapons inflicted. The psychological weight of facing German armor was real, built from experience and fear, and the constant awareness that a single penetrating hit could kill everyone in the crew compartment. Now he was being told that the enemy tank he feared, the Panzer IV that had spearheaded Rommel's victories in the desert, had the same armor protection as his Sherman. Not better, not the thick, impenetrable steel that mythology suggested. Just 50 millimeters, the same 51 millimeters on his own tank's hull. The realization was disorienting, almost offensive. Had they been afraid of a myth? Had German tactical victories been attributed to superior equipment, when the equipment was actually comparable? The gun was a different matter. Clark's report acknowledged that the German 75mm K-Go-K, 40 liters, 48 gun mounted on Panzer IVs, had better armor penetration than the American 75mm M3 gun. The German gun fired a longer, heavier projectile at higher muzzle velocity. At 500 yards, the German gun could penetrate approximately 92 millimeters of vertical armor, while the American gun penetrated 60 millimeters. This was a real advantage, significant in tank versus tank combat. But the armor itself, the protection that kept crews alive, was not superior. The Panzer IV could kill a Sherman more easily than a Sherman could kill a prepared Panzer IV at range, but both tanks could kill each other. Neither had immunity. The combat was more even than anyone had believed. American tankers were not facing invincible superweapons. They were facing competent enemy tanks operated by experienced crews, tanks that could be destroyed by American guns if American crews fought intelligently and used their advantages in numbers, coordination, and air support. The evidence accumulated throughout the summer of 1943, as American forces invaded Sicily in July and mainland Italy in September. More German tanks were captured and examined. Panzer IVs, Panzer VIIIs with their even thinner armor, and occasional examples of the newer Panthers and Tigers that were beginning to appear in limited numbers. The pattern held consistently. German medium tanks, the workhorses of the panzer divisions, had armor protection comparable to American medium tanks, not vastly superior, as intelligence estimates had suggested. In Sicily, the Hermann Göring Panzer Division deployed approximately 60 tanks, mostly Panzer IVs and Panzer IIIs. American and British forces destroyed or captured 47 of these tanks during the campaign. Ordnance teams examined 31 intact enough for detailed study. Every Panzer IV measured 50 mm frontal armor. Every Panzer III measured 50 mm maximum, with most having only 30 mm on earlier variants. The data was consistent and undeniable. At the Tank Automotive Center in Detroit, engineers received copies of the technical intelligence reports from North Africa and Sicily. They compared German specifications with American designs and with captured German technical manuals that provided official armor thickness data. The German military's own documentation confirmed what field measurements showed. Standard Panzer IV armor was 50 mm frontal, 30 mm side. There was no secret thicker armor. No special alloy that made the steel more resistant. German armor steel was high quality, properly heat-treated and face-hardened. But it was not dramatically superior to American armor steel. The realization forced a reassessment of combat losses. When a Sherman was knocked out by a Panzer IV, it was not because the German tank had overwhelmingly superior protection that made it immune to return fire. Both tanks were vulnerable, both could destroy the other. The difference in combat outcomes came from tactics, crew training, who saw the enemy first, who fired first, and who had better tactical positioning. These were factors American forces could address through training and doctrine, not insurmountable technological disadvantages. American tank commanders in Italy received updated intelligence briefings in October 1943. The briefings included photographs of captured Panzer IVs, with armor thickness measurements clearly labeled. They included comparative tables showing Sherman and Panzer IV specifications, side by side. The message was clear: your tank is not inferior, your armor protection is comparable, your gun is adequate at typical combat ranges. You can win tank engagements if you use proper tactics and fight aggressively. The psychological impact varied among crews. Some felt vindicated, their combat experiences making more sense in light of the new information. They had knocked out Panzer IVs in combat, and now understood why their guns were effective. Others felt betrayed, angry that they had gone into combat believing they were outmatched when the reality was more balanced. A few remained skeptical, unable to reconcile the technical data with their subjective experience of facing German armor. Staff Sergeant Paul Fischer, a tank commander in the 1st Armored Division who had fought through Tunisia and Sicily, recorded his reaction in letters home. "They told us today that the German tanks we've been fighting don't actually have thicker armor than our Shermans. They showed us the measurements from captured tanks. 50 millimeters, same as us basically. I don't know whether to be relieved or angry. We lost good men fighting those tanks, thinking they had this big advantage. Turns out they were just better at using what they had. Makes you think differently about everything." The updated intelligence filtered through American armored units slowly during late 1943 and early 1944. Training programs were revised to emphasize that American and German medium tanks had comparable armor protection. Tactical doctrine adjusted to encourage more aggressive engagement, rather than defensive positioning based on assumed inferiority. The mythology of German armor superiority began to crack, replaced by a more realistic assessment grounded in measured evidence rather than fear and rumor. But the mythology didn't disappear entirely. Old beliefs die hard, especially beliefs formed under combat stress. Many American tankers continued to regard German armor with excessive respect, even after seeing the technical data. The psychological weight of facing an enemy who had conquered most of Europe couldn't be erased by measurement reports and intelligence briefings. Fear and respect, once established, persisted, even when the rational basis for that fear was shown to be exaggerated. The reassessment of German armor capabilities fundamentally changed how American tank units approached combat in the European theater. By the time Allied forces landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, American armored doctrine had evolved beyond the defensive mindset that characterized early engagements in North Africa. Tank commanders understood their Shermans were not inferior to the Panzer IVs that still comprised the majority of German armored strength. This knowledge translated into more aggressive tactics and greater willingness to engage enemy armor directly. The 3rd Armored Division, landing in Normandy 2 weeks after D-Day, carried the lessons learned from 2 years of technical intelligence analysis. Officers briefed their crews using the actual measurements from captured German tanks. They showed photographs of Panzer IV armor with the 50mm thickness clearly marked. They emphasized that Sherman frontal armor, when properly angled, provided equal or better protection. The message was consistent: fight smart, use your advantages in numbers and coordination, but don't assume the enemy tank is invincible. Lieutenant Colonel Wilson Hawkins, commanding a tank battalion in the 3rd Armored, later described the psychological shift in his unit history. "The men had heard all the stories about German supertanks before we landed. Tigers and Panthers dominated the rumors, but we made sure every crew understood the reality. Most German armor we'd face were Panzer IVs, with armor no thicker than ours. Our gun could kill them. Their gun could kill us. Even fight, decided by who saw first and shot first, that changed how aggressively crews fought." The statistical evidence supported this tactical evolution. In Tunisia, during early 1943, American tank units often hesitated to engage German armor, waiting for supporting arms or favorable positioning before committing to combat. The kill-to-loss ratio reflected this caution. American forces destroyed approximately 1 German tank for every 1.3 American tanks lost in direct armor engagements. By the Italian campaign in late 1943 and early 1944, after the armor measurements had been widely disseminated, the ratio improved to approximately 1-to-1. American crews fought more confidently, achieving parity in tank versus tank combat. In France during the summer and fall of 1944, the ratio improved further to approximately 1.2 German tanks destroyed for every American tank lost when fighting Panzer IVs specifically. This improvement came partly from experience and better training, but also from the psychological confidence that came from knowing their equipment was adequate. American tankers no longer assumed they were outmatched. They fought as equals. using combined arms tactics and numerical superiority to achieve battlefield success. The reality of armor protection became evident in combat reports filed throughout the European campaign. When Shermans engaged Panzer IVs at typical combat ranges of 400 to 800 yards, both tanks could penetrate each other's frontal armor with well-aimed shots. The Sherman's 75mm gun, firing armor-piercing ammunition, could defeat 50mm of armor at these ranges. The Panzer IV's longer 75mm gun had better penetration, but not enough to guarantee kills against the Sherman's angled glacis, unless the shots struck at favorable angles. After-action reports from the 2nd Armored Division during the breakout from Normandy in late July 1944 documented numerous successful engagements against Panzer IVs. In one action near Marigny on July 26, a Sherman platoon from Company C engaged 5 Panzer IVs at ranges between 500 and 700 yards. 3 German tanks were destroyed, 1 was immobilized, and 1 escaped. 2 Shermans were hit but not penetrated due to angled impacts. No American tanks were lost. The platoon leader's report noted, "Enemy armor was vulnerable to our 75mm at combat ranges. No evidence of superior protection." The technical intelligence regarding armor thickness also influenced American tank development priorities. When the Ordnance Department evaluated proposals for improved Sherman variants in 1943, they focused on improving firepower rather than adding weight through thicker armor. The understanding that German medium tank armor was comparable to American armor meant that incremental armor increases on the Sherman would not provide decisive advantage. Better guns that could defeat German armor at longer ranges were more valuable. This analysis led to the development and deployment of the Sherman's 76mm gun variant, the M4A3 with 76mm. The new gun provided significantly better armor penetration, approximately 100mm at 500 yards, compared to 60mm for the standard 75mm. The 76mm armed Sherman entered combat in France in July 1944, giving American tank crews a weapon that could reliably defeat Panzer IV armor at ranges where the German gun was also effective. The playing field leveled further. The reassessment of German armor capabilities was accurate for the Panzer IV and other medium tanks that formed the backbone of panzer divisions. But the analysis also revealed the genuine superiority of Germany's heavy tanks, the Panther and Tiger, which began appearing in significant numbers during 1943. These vehicles represented a different category entirely, and technical intelligence reports documented their advantages clearly and soberly. The Panther tank, designated Panzer V by the Germans, mounted 80mm of frontal hull armor at a steep 55-degree angle, providing effective protection equivalent to approximately 140mm. The turret front had 100mm of armor. The main armament was a 75mm KK 42 liters, 70 gun, substantially more powerful than the Panzer IV's weapon. This gun could penetrate 138mm of armor at 500 yards, more than twice the penetration of the Sherman's 75mm gun. American ordnance teams examined captured Panthers with the same systematic approach used for Panzer IVs. They measured armor thickness, tested penetration resistance, evaluated gun performance. The conclusion was undeniable. The Panther was superior to the Sherman in armor protection and firepower. A frontal engagement between a Panther and a standard Sherman with 75mm gun was heavily disadvantaged for the American tank. The Sherman could not reliably penetrate the Panther's frontal armor at combat ranges, while the Panther could destroy a Sherman from over a mile away. The Tiger I was even more formidable. Frontal armor measured 100mm vertical, with 80mm on the turret sides. The 88mm KGO K36 gun could penetrate 112mm of armor at 1,000 yards. Against a Tiger, the Sherman with 75mm gun was critically outmatched in frontal engagements. American tactical doctrine emphasized flanking attacks, using numbers to surround German heavy tanks and attack their thinner side and rear armor. But here was the critical insight that technical intelligence provided. Panthers and Tigers were rare compared to Panzer IVs. German industry produced approximately 6,000 Panthers during the entire war, and only 1,300 Tigers. In contrast, Germany built approximately 8,500 Panzer IVs. When American tank units engaged German armor in France, Italy, or Germany itself, they faced Panzer IVs roughly 60 to 70% of the time. Panthers comprised perhaps 25% of encounters, Tigers less than 5%. The mythology before 1943 had lumped all German tanks together as superior. The reality was nuanced. German medium tanks were comparable. German heavy tanks were genuinely superior but uncommon. American numerical superiority meant that even when facing Panthers or Tigers, American forces could mass multiple Shermans against single German heavy tanks, accepting losses but achieving tactical objectives through overwhelming force. Staff Sergeant Richard Hansen, a Sherman commander in the 4th Armored Division, encountered this reality during the pursuit across France in August 1944. His platoon engaged a mixed German force near Château-d'Un that included 2 Panzer IVs and 1 Panther. The Panzer IVs were destroyed quickly at medium range. The Panther required coordinated fire from 4 Shermans, attacking from multiple angles simultaneously. 2 Shermans were knocked out before the Panther was finally disabled by shots into its side armor. Hansen later wrote, "The Panther was everything they said it was. Tough as hell, great gun. But there was only 1 of them, and 12 of us. The Panzer IVs went down like anything else. Most of what we fought was Panzer IVs, and those we could handle straight up." The statistical analysis of tank engagements in Northwest Europe from June through December 1944, compiled by the Operational Research Section of Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, documented the distribution of German tank types encountered. 63% of identified German tanks engaged were Panzer IVs, or older models. 24% were Panthers, 8% were Tigers, 5% were assault guns or tank destroyers. The numbers confirmed that American forces primarily faced German medium armor, that their Shermans could engage effectively, not the heavy tanks that dominated fears and rumors. The intelligence reports also documented German production constraints. Panther and Tiger tanks required substantially more manufacturing time and resources than Panzer IVs. A Panther took approximately 150,000 man-hours to build. A Tiger took 300,000 man-hours. A Panzer IV took approximately 75,000 man-hours. Germany's industrial capacity, increasingly strained by Allied bombing and resource shortages, could not produce heavy tanks in sufficient quantities to equip all panzer divisions. Most units continued to rely on Panzer IVs supplemented by small numbers of heavy tanks. This reality meant that the revised assessment of German armor capabilities, recognizing that medium tanks were comparable while heavy tanks were rare, accurately reflected what American tankers would encounter in combat. The fear of overwhelming German technological superiority was replaced by a more realistic understanding. Some German tanks were better, but most were not, and American advantages in numbers and support arms compensated for individual vehicle weaknesses. The systematic examination of captured Panzer IVs in Tunisia during early 1943 represented more than just technical intelligence gathering. It represented a confrontation between mythology and measurable reality, between fear based on reputation and confidence based on evidence. The 50mm armor measurements documented by Captain Clark and his ordnance teams shattered assumptions that had shaped American armored doctrine and affected the psychological state of every tanker going into combat. The legacy of this reassessment extended beyond World War II into post-war military thinking. American armored doctrine in the decades following 1945 emphasized the importance of accurate technical intelligence and realistic threat assessment. The tendency to overestimate enemy capabilities, while prudent for ensuring preparedness, could become counterproductive if it paralyzed initiative or led to excessively defensive tactics. The Panzer IV experience taught that systematic examination of enemy equipment provided better foundation for doctrine than assumptions based on enemy reputation. The measurements also influenced post-war tank development. American designers recognized that medium tank armor in the 30 to 50-ton weight class would always involve compromises between protection, firepower, and mobility. No tank could be invulnerable while remaining mobile enough for exploitation and pursuit. The M26 Pershing heavy tank, which entered combat in limited numbers during the final months of the European War, and its successor the M46 Patton, reflected lessons learned from comparative analysis of American and German armor. These tanks prioritized firepower with 90mm guns capable of defeating heavy German armor, while accepting that their own armor remained vulnerable to enemy fire. For the men who had fought in Tunisia, Sicily, and Italy before the armor reassessment became widely known, the revelation carried complex emotions. Some felt vindicated, understanding that their combat successes against German armor reflected skill and proper tactics rather than just luck. Others felt betrayed by intelligence estimates that had overstated German capabilities, leading them into combat with unnecessary fear. A few remained skeptical, unable to reconcile technical measurements with their subjective experience of German armor's effectiveness. Lieutenant James Bates, who had been among the first to examine the captured Panzer IV outside Sidi Bouzid, continued serving through the Italian campaign and into southern France. He survived the war and returned to civilian life in Ohio, where he rarely spoke about his combat experiences. In a brief oral history interview conducted in 1982, he reflected on the moment he learned German armor was not superior. It changed everything and nothing at the same time. Changed everything because you realized the equipment was fine. You weren't driving something inadequate. Changed nothing because people were still dying, tanks were still burning, and whether the armor was 50mm or 80mm didn't bring anyone back. But it helped to know we had a fair chance, that it wasn't rigged against us from the start. The broader historical significance lies in what the Panzer IV's armor measurements revealed about industrial warfare, and the gap between perception and reality. Germany had developed a reputation for technological superiority based on early war successes and impressive heavy tank designs. This reputation influenced Allied thinking and tactical approaches throughout the war. But the reality was more nuanced. German medium tanks, the vehicles that actually fought most battles, were comparable to Allied medium tanks in protection and somewhat better in firepower. German advantages came from tactical skill, crew experience, and effective use of combined arms, not from overwhelmingly superior technology in most encounters. American industrial capacity allowed production of tanks in quantities Germany could never match. The Sherman was designed for mass production and global deployment. Over 49,000 were built by 10 major manufacturers and hundreds of subcontractors. This numerical superiority, combined with adequate technical capabilities, proved decisive. Germany built excellent individual tanks like the Panther and Tiger, but could not build enough of them to matter strategically. The Panzer IV, Germany's most produced tank at approximately 8,500 in units, was outnumbered nearly 6-to-1 by Shermans alone, not counting other Allied tank types. The reassessment of German armor capabilities represented a moment of clarity in the fog of war. Technical measurements and systematic analysis cut through mythology and fear, revealing reality. The Panzer IV had 50mm of frontal armor, no more. American Shermans had comparable protection. The fight was fair, decided by skill and circumstances rather than predetermined by equipment disparities. This knowledge empowered American tankers, enabling more aggressive tactics and greater confidence in combat. When Captain Clark stood in the Tunisian desert measuring that captured Panzer IV, documenting dimensions that contradicted intelligence estimates and common belief, he was doing more than collecting data. He was providing truth to men who would risk their lives based on what they believed about enemy capabilities. That truth, uncomfortable and surprising as it was, gave them a fair assessment of the odds they faced. In war, where so much is uncertain and deceptive, that kind of clarity was itself a form of weapon, perhaps as valuable as any gun or armor plate. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.